There's a moment when responsibility stops being abstract and becomes a conversation between two men in a room. That moment arrived recently on Apple Music's Rap Life Review, when Curtis Jackson decided that 20 years of unspoken resentment needed an audience. The occasion was a VERZUZ recap following the Donald Jones and Joe matchup. Instead, it became a reckoning. 50 Cent showed up with Tony Yayo and Uncle Murda, representatives of his G-Unit legacy. The event itself had been successful. The VERZUZ on August 20th featured two masters of their craft, two men whose catalogs defined an era of R&B that predated the fragmentation of taste. But when 50 sat down with Ebro Darden and the other panelists to discuss what happened on stage, on a different character, the conversation shifted, the tone changed, and suddenly they were no longer talking about Joe or Donald Jones. They were talking about New York. 50 started the volley without preamble. The culture of New York hip-hop had shifted toward the South, he said. The regional dominance that once meant something, that once guaranteed radio play and critical attention and commercial success, had evaporated. And he was placing that responsibility on Ebro's shoulders. I'ma leave that for Ebro, 'cause he always **K up the culture. He said. The words carried the weight of somebody who had been holding on to this particular grievance for years. Ebro didn't deflect. He responded immediately, his argument lean and pointed. 50 Cent had created the conditions for New York's decline by starting beef with of artists, by positioning himself as a territorial force that demanded exclusive loyalty. The effect was paralyzing. Artists who might have collaborated didn't. Potential alliances dissolved before they formed. The broadcaster argued that the G-Unit mogul had everybody beefing and caused a lack of new releases. This is where the argument becomes more complex than a simple blame assignment. 50 Cent's response shifted the terrain. He acknowledged the feuds, but he recontextualized them. He explained that he didn't have many real friends, and ran into loyalty issues, framing his argument more about having to choose relationships in contentious situations, eventually setting things right. The implication was that the beef wasn't a choice he made to dominate New York. It was a survival mechanism. But then he pivoted. He returned to his original accusation but sharpened it. 50 Cent took issue with which artists Ebro did or didn't play on the radio, asking, who was coming and didn't get a shot or didn't get into a good position because I didn't work with them. He also said Ebro really ate up the whole system. The question cuts through the noise of personal history. It suggests that the real damage to New York came not from one artist's territorial nature, but from the failure of a gatekeeper to do his job. Hot 97 had been central to New York hip-hop's infrastructure. For decades, it was the platform. It was where emerging artists proved themselves. It was where the city's sound was defined and defended and promoted to the world. By the time Ebro became its program director, by the time he had the power to shape what songs got airplay and which artists got championed, something had already shifted. Streaming was ascendant. Radio's cultural authority was waning. But the stations still mattered enough to matter. The argument between them circles back repeatedly to the question of power. Who had it, when they had it, and what they chose to do with it. 50 Cent's power was artistic and social. He could make records that dominated. He could draw artists into his orbit or push them away. He could determine what seemed cool and what seemed risky. Ebro's power was structural. He had institutional authority over a major radio station in the city where hip-hop was born. He controlled the playlist. He decided which sounds got amplified and which got obscured. What neither man fully articulates is that these were different kinds of power operating in different eras. By the time Ebro was making those programming decisions, radio had stopped being the primary distribution mechanism for music. Streaming platforms were making their own decisions about what to promote. Social media was creating its own tastemakers. The infrastructure that had given Hot 97 its power was already in decline. Ebro was making curations for an audience that was getting smaller, even if they didn't know it yet. The South had momentum. Atlanta, Houston, Miami. These cities had sounds that resonated with what was happening culturally. Trap music wasn't something that New York artists were failing to create. It was something that other regions had created first, had perfected, and had positioned as the sound of the present moment. When New York artists moved toward trap, when they chased Southern sounds, they were chasing commercial viability, not betraying their heritage. But the question of 50 Cent's role in this remains unresolved. His feuds with Ja Rule, with Fat Joe, with Jadakiss, these created real damage. They created sides. They created an atmosphere where collaboration wasn't just a creative choice, but a political statement. If you worked with certain people, you were opposed to 50 Cent. If you wanted 50 Cent's backing, you had to pick. That's not nothing. That shaped careers. That shaped which artists got resources and which didn't. Yet even this interpretation requires acknowledging that 50 Cent didn't invent the competitive nature of hip-hop. He was playing by rules that had been established long before he arrived. The difference was that he had more power than most artists to enforce those rules. He had the biggest records. He had the most political capital. He was, for a period, the biggest artist in the world. And he used that position to settle scores. Ebro's critique is that this created an environment where unity wasn't possible. New York had always been defined by a competitive spirit. Yes, but also by a sense of collective identity. You were beefing, but you were still New York. The feuds in the late 90s and early 2000s, they created the sense that allegiance to the city came second to allegiance to a crew, to a label, to an artist. The conversation on Rap Life Review never reached a resolution, because there isn't one that both men can accept. 50 Cent believes that Ebro, as a gatekeeper, failed to shepherd New York's sound into the modern era. Ebro believes that 50 Cent's territorial impulses fractured the city at a moment when unity might have sustained it. Both observations contain truth. Both reflect a desire to locate responsibility in an individual, when the actual culprit is a combination of market forces, technological change, and the simple fact that cultural momentum doesn't stay in one place forever. What stands out in the exchange is that 50 Cent, the artist who was once the personification of New York dominance, now seems more invested in preserving or mourning that dominance than Ebro, who still works in the city's media landscape. 50 has diversified. He's built television empires. Ebro remained tied to radio, which is a medium in decline. The irony is that the guy who was blamed for damaging New York has moved on. The guy who was supposed to protect it is still working within the diminished platform that represents its loss of power. There's also an unspoken element in this debate, a generational question about what it means for New York to not dominate hip-hop anymore. For decades, that was non-negotiable. The idea that a city from the South could define the sound, that West Coast rap could exist as something other than an alternative, that the coasts could be less important than the regions in between. This was unthinkable in the 90s. Yet, it happened. And it happened partly because the music industry stopped caring as much about geographic identity as it cared about regional sounds. 50 Cent was also partly a victim of his own success. He was so dominant that he became the face of New York in a way that actually obscured other possibilities. Other artists existed, but they operated in his shadow. When the culture shifted, when the industry's attention moved away from New York entirely, those other voices didn't have the platform or the visibility to redefine what New York rap could be. Question of who ruined New York hip-hop is ultimately a question about whether anyone could have stopped what was coming. Could 50 Cent have sacrificed his territorial instincts and pursued a model of unity? Maybe. But it's unclear whether unity would have mattered if the fundamental economics of music had already shifted away from New York. Could Ebro have played different records on the radio and changed the trajectory? Possibly. But radio was already becoming irrelevant as a tastemaker by the time he was in a position to make those decisions. What remains most striking about their exchange is not the blame, but the care. Both men still care about what happened to New York. They still believe it matters. They still think that New York should be making the music that defines the culture. They're stuck in the past in a particular way, not nostalgic exactly, but convinced that something was lost that shouldn't have been lost, and determined to find someone to blame for that loss. The VERZUZ that prompted this conversation was itself a reminder of what New York no longer is. Donell Jones and Joe, both artists who emerged from New York's sound and operated within its orbit, but neither of whom defined it. Of an era when New York was still central but already losing ground, the platform that brought them together, VERZUZ itself, is a platform that celebrates legacy more than it creates new movements. It's backward-looking by design, and it's fitting that when 50 Cent showed up to discuss this particular VERZUZ, the conversation became an argument about what New York had lost and who let it slip away.